think you're a better fighter now than you were when you were champion?
Well, I don't think so.
These days is former champion Jimmy Ellis.
Well, I try to box as much as I can, but after he gave me a pin, chased me to a corner, I got to fight my way out.
Imagine training side by side with Muhammad Ali.
It's so great to pay his dollar to get in here. Don't let it pass for nothing.
Becoming heavyweight champion of the world, and then ending up working for the city parks department. Sounds like a movie plot, right? For Jimmy Ellis, this was real life.
I think he's able to regain the title. Muhammad's a real good fighter. I've been knowing this about all my life, and I know what the guy can do.
But before the tragedy, there was triumph. Before the silence, there were roaring crowds. A tale of a man who once shared the ring with legends, only to fade into obscurity. What twist of fate led Jimmy from the ring to a regular job, or to the deadly disease that cost him his life? Let's turn back the clock and relive the rise and fall of a man who once shared the ring with legends. Jimmy Ellis was born on February 24, 1940, in Louisville, Kentucky. One of 10 children in a Christian household, he grew up with a strong work ethic instilled by his father, Walter, a pastor. As a teenager, Jimmy found himself working in a cement finishing factory. It wasn't glamorous, but it put food on the table for his family. But fate has a funny way of changing things, doesn't it? One day, Jimmy's watching TV, and there's his friend Donnie Hall in an amateur boxing match. And who's Donnie fighting? None other than Cassius Clay, the guy who'd later become Muhammad Ali. As he watched, a thought sparked in his mind like a match in a dark factory. I could do a better job, he said to himself. So what does Jimmy do? He seeks out Joe Martin, a police officer who'd been training Clay. Martin had an eye for talent, and when he saw Jimmy, he saw potential. The same potential he'd seen in Clay. Before long, Jimmy and Cassius were not just training partners, but close friends. Imagine that. Two kids from Louisville, both destined for boxing greatness. Jimmy threw himself into amateur boxing with everything he had. Out of 66 bouts, he won 59. That's not just good, that's spectacular. He even became a Golden Gloves champion. But Jimmy wasn't content. He had his sights set on something bigger, the Olympics. In 1960, Jimmy came within a whisker of making the Olympic team. He fought his heart out, but in the end, he lost to Wilbert McClure, who went on to win gold. Losing an Olympic spot might have crushed some people, but not Jimmy. It just made him more determined. Only a year later, he said goodbye to the cement factory and hello to the professional boxing ring. His first fight was a victory over Arlie Safer at Freedom Hall in Louisville. Not a bad way to start a career. But Jimmy wasn't just a guy who traded cement for canvas. He was a man who dared to dream big, a man who looked at his circumstances and said, I can do better. It's about the power of friendship too. Think about it. Jimmy and Cassius Clay, two kids from the same town, both rising to the top of the boxing world. Who could have predicted that? But turning pro isn't always the fairy tale ending folks imagine. For Jimmy, it was more like opening Pandora's box. Picture this. It's 1961, and Ellis is fresh-faced, ready to conquer the middleweight division. But hold on to your hats because the next few years were going to be a wild ride. He starts racking up wins, sure, but he's also tasting defeat. And some of those losses were bitter pills to swallow. Take his first encounter with Holly Mims. Ellis steps into the ring, confident and ready. But Mims got other ideas. Jimmy walks away with his first pro loss, and it stings. But 6 months later, they meet again. This time, Jimmy's done his homework. He's learned, adapted, and guess what? He avenges that loss. It's a sweet victory, folks, and a sign of things to come. Now let's talk about 1962. Henry Hank with 73 fights under his belt. Ellis takes a beating, his face a mess of blood and bruises. But he doesn't go down easy. He fights tooth and nail, only to lose by decision. It's a hard lesson, but one that shows Jimmy's got a heart to spare. Fast forward to 1964. Madison Square Garden, the big lights, the big stage, and Ellis is facing none other than Reuben Hurricane Carter. Jimmy hangs tough for 4 rounds, trading blows with one of the most feared punchers in the game. But in the fifth, Hurricane lives up to his name. Ellis hits the canvas. He gets up, but it's not enough. Another loss by unanimous decision. By the end of 64, Ellis is looking at a record of 15 wins and 5 losses. Not bad for most guys, but not great. Those losses to Don Fulmer and George Benton were wake-up calls. Our boy's at a crossroads, and he knows it. The middleweight division in those days was a shark tank. Every fight was a war, every opponent a potential world beater. Ellis had been swimming with the sharks, all right, but he was starting to feel like chum. He needed an edge, something to push him over the top. You know how they say behind every great man is a great woman? I'm sure there's a great woman behind you. For Jimmy, that woman was his wife, Mary. She wasn't just his better half. She was his biggest cheerleader, his rock. When Jimmy's career was hitting the skids, Mary stepped up to the plate. Picture this: Jimmy Ellis, once a promising middleweight, thinking about hanging up the gloves for good. But Mary had other plans. She knew Jimmy had more fight left in him, and she was determined to prove it. So what did Mary do? She grabbed a pen and paper and wrote a letter. But not just any letter. She reached out to the legendary Angelo Dundee. You know, the guy who trained Muhammad Ali? Yeah, that Angelo Dundee. And she ended her letter with 5 little words: P.S. H-E-E-E-E-L-P. When Dundee got that letter, something about it grabbed his attention. Maybe it was the raw emotion, or maybe he sensed untapped potential. Whatever it was, he decided to give Jimmy a shot. So Jimmy packs his bags and heads down to Miami. But when he shows up at Dundee's gym, he's a far cry from a heavyweight contender. Here's this guy weighing a measly 150 pounds, battling tonsillitis to boot. Dundee must have been scratching his head. But Dundee, being the master trainer he was, saw a diamond in the rough. He looked at Jimmy and thought, this kid's got something. He just needs some work. And work they did. It wasn't easy, but day after day, he trained, ate right, and slowly transformed himself. And then the wins started coming. We're talking knockout victories, folks. Under Dundee's guidance, Ellis went on a tear, racking up 7 straight wins. 3 of those were first-round knockouts. But Dundee knew that real money was with the heavyweights. So Jimmy kept pushing, kept growing. That 150-pound guy who showed up in Miami was history. In his place stood a lean, mean fighting machine, ready to take on the world. Now you're probably wondering, sure, he could beat up on middleweights, but how's he gonna fare against the heavyweights? Well, that was the million-dollar question. Jimmy had come a long way, but the real test was yet to come. As Dundee put it, I just fine-tuned him. He had a lot of talent, and boy, was that talent about to be put to the test. Jimmy Ellis was on the verge of something big. He'd gone from a struggling middleweight to a heavyweight contender. But could he hang with the big boys? Could he stand toe-to-toe with the likes of Ali, Frazier, and Foreman? Remember when Muhammad Ali got stripped of his title? It was like someone hit the reset button on the heavyweight division. Chaos, confusion, and opportunity all rolled into one. And there, right in the middle of it all, was Jimmy Ellis. The guy who'd been scrapping his way up from the middleweight ranks suddenly found himself with a golden ticket to the big time. The World Boxing Association, trying to fill the void left by Ali, cooked up an 8-man tournament to crown a new heavyweight champ. Ellis, fresh off his transformation from middleweight to heavyweight, got an invite. He was ranked 8th in the world, but let's be real, he was the odd man out in a field of heavyweights. Can you imagine what was going through his mind as he stepped into that tournament? Here he was, a guy who not too long ago was weighing in at 150 pounds, about to mix it up with the big boys. It must have felt like David stepping into a ring full of Goliaths. His first fight was against Leotis Martin. For 9 rounds, Ellis schooled Martin with speed and skill that nobody saw coming. By the time the ref stepped in to stop the fight, Martin's face looked like it had gone through a meat grinder. Next up was Oscar Bonavina. Twice during the fight, Ellis sent Bonavina to the canvas. When the final bell rang, there was no doubt. Ellis had outboxed and outsmarted one of the toughest guys in the division. The final hurdle was Jerry Quarry. This was it, 15 rounds for all the marbles. Ellis put on a masterclass in boxing. He slipped, He moved, he countered. When the dust settled, Jimmy Ellis had done the unthinkable. The judges handed down a split decision, and just like that, the former middleweight was now the WBA heavyweight champion of the world. But here's where our story takes a turn. Being heavyweight champ wasn't all champagne and roses. The boxing world wasn't quite ready to roll out the red carpet for Ellis. There were whispers, doubts. Some folks started calling him a paper champion. They pointed to Ali's absence, to the fact that Joe Frazier, the top contender, hadn't even bothered with the WBA tournament. It was a bittersweet victory. Ellis had reached the mountaintop, but the view wasn't quite what he'd expected. He was the champ, sure, but in a divided kingdom. The crown sat heavy on his head, weighed down by the skepticism of the boxing community and the shadow of the man they called the greatest. You ever heard the saying, "Be careful what you wish for"? Well, Jimmy Ellis was about to learn that lesson the hard way. That crown he fought so hard for was about to become a target on his back. Ellis stepped into the ring as the new champ, ready to prove himself. His first title defense was against Floyd Patterson, a former two-time heavyweight champion. Talk about a baptism by fire. The Patterson fight was no cakewalk. 15 grueling rounds, a broken nose and a cut eye for Ellis. A controversial victory that left fans divided. Ellis had his hand raised, but at what cost? It wasn't exactly the glorious reign he dreamed of, and just when he thought things couldn't get tougher, they did. Ellis found himself sidelined for 17 long months. Canceled fights left him watching from the sidelines while the boxing world moved on. But while Ellis was cooling his heels, a storm was brewing, a storm named Joe Frazier. Undefeated, relentless, with a left hook that could knock the paint off a battleship. February 16, 1970, Madison Square Garden, Ellis versus Frazier to unify the heavyweight championship. The odds weren't in Ellis's favor, and as soon as the bell rang, everyone could see why. For 4 rounds, Ellis stood his ground against a hurricane, but Frazier's legendary left hook lived up to the hype. 2 devastating knockdowns in the 4th round. Ellis struggling to find his feet, the crowd on the edge of their seats. When the bell rang for the 5th, Ellis's corner had seen enough. Angelo Dundee, the man who had guided Ellis to the top, threw in the towel. Ellis's reign was over. His first knockout loss in a fight for all the marbles. And just like that, the crown he had fought so hard for slipped from his grasp, leaving him to grapple with the harsh realities of life at the top of the boxing world. The view from up there can make the fall even harder. After losing his heavyweight title to Joe Frazier in 1970, Ellis found himself on a comeback trail that was more like a roller coaster ride through boxing hell. At first, things looked promising. Ellis racked up 3 straight wins, showing he still had some fight left in him. But then came the big test, a showdown with his old friend and sparring partner, Muhammad Ali. On July 26, 1971, Ellis stepped into the ring with the greatest, and for a while it looked like he might just pull off the upset of the century. But boxing's a cruel mistress. In the 4th round, Ali caught Ellis with a right hand that changed everything. He managed to hang on for 8 more rounds, but the damage was done. After the fight, Jimmy told it like it was. "The right hand hurt me so bad I couldn't really fight my best after that. It ruined me." Then came June 18, 1973. The opponent, Ernie Shavers, a man with fists like sledgehammers. Ellis started strong, even had Shavers wobbling in the 1st round. But boxing fans, you know how this story goes. Shavers caught Ellis with a thunderous right uppercut, and just like that, it was lights out. From there, Ellis's career became a flickering flame in a storm. He couldn't buy a win. 5 fights, 5 disappointments. He lost a split decision to Boone Kirkman, a fighter he would have handled easily in his prime. Father Time was throwing combination punches at Jimmy's career, and he was running out of answers. The rematch with Joe Frazier on March 2, 1975, was like watching the last flare of a dying star. For 3 rounds, Ellis turned back the clock, but Smokin' Joe was relentless. By the 9th round, Dundee threw in the towel, saving his fighter from further punishment. The final blow came in a routine sparring session, leaving Ellis partially blind in his left eye. At 35, Jimmy Ellis threw his last punch as a professional, knocking out Carl Baker on May 6, 1975. All those years of blood, sweat, and tears. And what did he have to show for it? A clouded eye and a head full of memories. They say a boxer dies twice. The first time is when he retires. For Jimmy Ellis, that first death came with a bitter pill to swallow. Life after boxing had a few fancy footwork moves of its own for him, and this time, the punches came from places he never saw coming. You'd think a man who'd stood toe-to-toe with Muhammad Ali would have it made, but for Jimmy, hanging up the gloves was like stepping into a whole new ring. No more roaring crowds, no more bright lights, just the quiet of everyday life. And let me tell you, that silence can be deafening for a guy who lived for the roar of the arena. In 1989, Jimmy traded his boxing gloves for a new kind of public service. The Louisville Parks Department became his new arena. For 14 years, he worked on athletic and recreational projects. Those hands that once knocked out Carl Baker now planted trees and maintained ball fields. But life threw Jimmy a curveball he couldn't sidestep. Dementia, the cruel irony of it all. The man with the lightning-fast reflexes, now struggling to keep up with his own thoughts. His family saw it happening, and they couldn't help but wonder, was it the boxing? All those years of taking hits, was this the final, devastating blow? Even as the fog of dementia set in, there was one thing it couldn't touch: Jimmy's heart. His family remained proud of his achievements. That world title wasn't just a belt, it was a legacy, a testament to what a small-town kid from Louisville could do with a pair of gloves and a whole lot of grit. Through it all, there was Mary, Jimmy's rock, his corner woman in the fight of his life, 6 kids they raised together. But life's got a mean left hook. In 2006, Mary passed away, and Jimmy's mind played the cruelest trick. In those final years, he'd sometimes forget she was gone, talking about her like she was still there, still by his side. On May 6, 2014, exactly 39 years after his last professional fight, Jimmy Ellis threw his last punch. Muhammad Ali, Jimmy's old friend and rival, said it best. In the world of heavyweights, I always thought of him as one of the best. High praise from the greatest himself. His story's more than just boxing glory. It's a tale that'll make you think about the price of fame in the ring. Muhammad Ali called Ellis one of the best in the heavyweight world. And he wasn't wrong. Ellis had skills, taking down big names like Patterson and Quarry. But all that glory came at a cost. From cement factory worker to heavyweight champ, Ellis climbed to the top, only to have it all slip away. For one shining moment, he was on top of the world. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? Was the price of fame in boxing too high? What do you think? We'd love to hear your thoughts, so please leave a comment below. And if you like this video, don't forget to click the subscribe button so we can continue making boxing content like this. See you in the next one.